The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of two webinars we're running for the creative and tech sectors on entering the China market. This one is focusing on IP and working with partners in China. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I'm the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas for our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, Ask the Experts forum, and our Export Action Plan tool. You can find all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for international trade, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, and you can ask questions at any point during this webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have two fantastic speakers today, with Tom Simpson from China Britain Business Council giving an overview of the opportunities for companies from the two sectors in China, and then Mathew Alderson from Harris Bricken will then go into greater depth about some of the things you really should be thinking about in terms of IP and working with Chinese partners. But to kick things off, over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. Good morning to those in the UK, and good afternoon or good evening even to those here in China. So my name is Tom Simpson. I'm the head of creative industries and sports at the China Britain Business Council. I've been asked today to speak on the subject of creative meets tech. And I decided to go for the title of exploring China's digital technology landscape in search of opportunities for UK creative industries exporters. And yeah, if we move to the next slide, I'll run through a quick intro to what I'll be covering today. So to kick off, I'll be starting with a summary of current political thoughts and media control in China, which is sort of to help set the scene and give a sort of idea of the current situation here with regards to those areas, which it's impossible to ignore when working in China. Following on from that, I'll be giving an overview of China's digital parallel universe, as I've named it, which essentially is a run-through of China's digital landscape and how it differs from that in the West and the one that we're familiar with in the UK. Following on from that, I'll take a closer look at the landscape and also the opportunities for UK exporters in three key areas: games, video, VODs, so video on demand, and also applications. And then to summarize, I'll do a roundup. I'm conscious that I've got about sort of 20 minutes, 25 minutes, so I may breeze through a few slides in order to make sure we get through everything. So let's jump to the next slide. So first, just a quick overview, introduction to the China Britain Business Council. We're a membership organization headquartered out of London. We have 13 offices in China, of the main offices in Beijing and Shanghai. We have a range of different services that we offer for British companies, including market research, market visits. So if a company wants to visit China, we can arrange a program of meetings for that company if they're coming over here. We also have a service called Launchpad, where CBBC, we take on all the back end, so the HR and the finance responsibilities for employing a member of staff on behalf of a UK company. We currently have around 65 launch pads in our offices here in China. So it's a very highly subscribed service. In fact, we've just expanded the office here in Beijing to accommodate a further 8 launchpad desks. And so, yeah, but for more information on the China Business Council, please, visit our website, cbbc.org, or get in touch with me direct. And you're very happy to jump on a call and talk in more detail about what we do. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so just to kick things off, Xi Jinping and party ideology. So for the last 5 years, since President Xi took power, he's been sort of consolidating his position at the head of the party, head of the state, and is now very much a sort of all-powerful figure here in China. He has very strong views on media control, and also, in particular, cyber sovereignty, as he's been, known to refer to China's cyberspace. China very much sees its cyberspace as being its own sovereignty, and everyone who's joining this webinar will surely have heard of the Great Firewall, and the implications of that. People here in China cannot access Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also a lot of sort of major news media, and also services as well, such as Apple's iBook service or iTunes, which I'll get onto that more later on. And in the last last 5 years, there's been a raft of new measures that have come into place to block or remove undesirable content. So either quotas, which I'll talk about later on, or censorship, which again, I'll also talk about shortly. So the media sector, as I say, is increasingly regulated. We've seen on a sort of consistent basis new regulation come in and tighten up spaces that perhaps like the VOD space, where it used to be a bit of a free space for Chinese companies to essentially stream content that was uncensored, that wasn't going through the sort of usual importation processes of theatrical content, and was a bit of a sort of free ground in terms of what they were able to do. That changed very sharply in 2015, and now we have this quota system where VODs have to balance their foreign content in a sort of 100 hour to 30 hour ratio. So for every 100 hours of domestic Chinese content, a VOD platform is permitted to have up to 30 hours of foreign content. So that obviously had a big impact when it came in, and it was noticeable the effect that pretty much overnight had on these VOD platforms, who dropped a lot of TV shows and films as a result. Also, SARF must now approve all games before their release. So mobile games, PC games, this process usually takes around 30 days. And in the case of where it's a story-based game, the process can be much lengthier. So this is another example of regulation that's come in the last couple of years that's made things a bit more difficult. And just to round that off, so another example, and there are much more than just these 3 examples. Foreign companies are no longer allowed to self-publish games or apps in China, and must go through a local company. And foreign participation, including foreign ownership and joint ventures, are now prohibited. And so when this rule came in, it affected quite a number of major companies who were operating here, operating their games business and publishing their own games in China. Yeah, they've now sort of, the dust has settled somewhat on that front, but it was certainly a bit of a sidewinder for these companies. And lastly, censorship. Censorship, I mean, I think Mathew might talk a bit more about this during his session, and about the regulation in general. You know, just a few points from my side. It's often unpredictable with arbitrary rulings. It's very hard to predict, you know, what decisions will be made on certain, you know, films or TV shows or games. Often things that nobody expects will be an issue or an issue. But then, as I put below, local companies are act as a pre-censorship buffer of sorts. So local companies, they know what will and won't work here. Will and won't be allowed. And so, you know, the partners that you work with in China will help to guide with regards to censorship. So it's not something that UK companies will have to navigate on their own. So that's, yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. And I should add, yeah, this is somewhat of a crash course on China's digital media landscape. So, so yeah, this is obviously very sort of top line stuff. But the regulators, I've highlighted two of the key regulators here. The first being SAFT for short, the State Administration for Press, Publications, Radio, Film and Television. They are responsible for the regulation of content for the media industry, both digital and non-digital. So they are the guys that oversee censorship, both of domestic and foreign content. And you need to get their approval if you are wanting to get your game, your film, your TV show released in China. And then the other regulator I wanted to highlight is the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, who are responsible. Responsibilities include the regulation of Chinese telecommunications, including the internet, and also software companies. Games companies fall under the umbrella of software companies in China. So games development is a responsibility of MIT. But then just to sort of, I suppose, highlight where sometimes things can be a little bit confusing, where MIT are responsible for games development, SAFT are responsible for online publishing and advertising of games, both online and offline. And so it's, yeah, sometimes actually they will issue joint announcements between MIT and SAFT, because there is actually overlap between what they're both doing, or at least they brush up very close with each other. So that's just a quick run through of the regulators, so you know who they are. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this slide here is just a kind of a quick. I won't dwell on this slide for too long. I think that, you know, we could discuss this slide for hours, but it's just to highlight how things can be quite complex when it comes to the structure of how things work here. I'll just quickly sort of run through the rings. So for the red ring, that's the Communist Party of China, which is sort of the brain of the operation. The blue ring is the state, so they are the ones who administer the rules that, and ideology that's set by the party. And then you have the state-owned enterprises who sit directly below those guys. And then I put the sort of private sector right down at the bottom, both the Chinese and foreign private sector, who sort of, you know, are very much, well, outside of the party and state oversight, but are feeding into that ring from the outside. Yeah, the point here really is just to sort of highlight the complexity of how things work here. And often it can be quite confusing for companies who are new to China, and and are coming here for the first time and trying to figure all this out. But yeah, if we go on to my next slide. But there's good news. And the good news is that when working in China, it's very rare that a foreign company will come here and have to navigate that sort of landscape entirely on their own. If you're working in any of these areas, you're very almost guaranteed to have to be working with a local company, and these companies will be very familiar with this landscape. Will have relationships with people that are in these regulatory bodies, and will know exactly how to go about approaching the rules, and also if need be, directly engage with these regulators to negotiate on perhaps a censorship issue or an access issue. So yeah, that's some good news. I realize that those first few slides are actually can feel a bit sort of daunting and perhaps a bit negative, but yeah, you won't be on your own essentially. Next slide. Okay, so we're on to the second section, which is China's digital parallel universe, as I call it. Here you'll see in the middle of the ring, there are the American, well, mostly American, I think, well, probably entirely American internet companies who provide various services from microblogging to mobile social mobile, instant messaging, etc. And the Chinese equivalents who operate here. Because of the Great Firewall, most of these American companies aren't here. Well, all of them aren't here, operating pretty much. I mean, LinkedIn are operating here to some extent, and I'll talk more about Apple and Steam, who are active here. But essentially, you're looking at a completely different landscape when it comes to China. And so, yeah, next slide. So here, yeah, we'll take a closer look at the core networks. You might recognize a few of those logos. Up in the top left, you've got Xinlang Weibo with the red eye, which is Weibo. You have QQ, Instant Messenger, Penguin. You have WeChat, the two speech bubbles. Youku, Tudo, and the video side of things, and then down at the bottom you have Taobao, which is Alibaba's e-commerce platform. So just to kind of run very, very quickly through some of the sort of core networks there. But what we'll be focusing on today are those networks on the right-hand side. At the top we have some of the major Chinese Android app stores, which I'll be talking about in more detail. In the middle, we have some of China's major games companies, Tencent, NetEase, Youzu. And then at the bottom, we have the VOD platforms, 6 of whom I'll run through quickly later. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of foreign platforms, what exists in China? First up, Steam. So Steam has a China storefront, which leans into China from the outside. It is not actually a registered platform in China. It leans in from the outside, but delivers games to its customers on local servers. I put the question, how long will this continue? I mean, nobody knows. I mean, how they've managed to get as far as they have so far is impressive, and I'm sure that's required a lot of work on their side to get it to this point. But it's a sort of fragile business model, if for sure, because it could be shut off at any time. But it is a channel which companies can make sell games to Chinese users, because Chinese users are able to register and use the platform and make payments. The Apple ecosystem, very much a shadow of itself in China. In the West, you have the ecosystem which basically allows users to interact in all sorts of different ways with Apple services. Here in China, essentially, only service that really exists is App Store. iBooks, iTunes were blocked in April 2016, no longer accessible, and Apple Pay was essentially a failure in China. It launched to quite well, quite strongly, but very quickly died, and is no longer it's dominated by WeChat wallet and Alipay. And Google, so everybody knows about Google's problems in China. All of Google's services are blocked in China, including Google Play. But despite that, Google Play still has an impressive 3.7% coverage in China. And interestingly, users here in China who are using the Google Play platform will be accessing it through a VPN, and will be downloading games that they can access, or apps that they can access on the Chinese app stores. And so they'll see the Chinese app stores being the Chinese apps, and then Google Play as being the overseas Western Android app store access point. So Google Play still does have a coverage in China. I added Spotify here. We're not going to talk about music streaming today, but just as a point that although it's not available in App Store China, those who are subscribed to Spotify services can and do receive service here in China. I know that because I'm a Spotify user myself, and they're still able to deliver very good quality service. And yeah, just lastly, just to kind of highlight the point, there is no legal way for foreign companies to incorporate a business in China for the purpose of delivering content service to Chinese users. And that's either as a wholly owned foreign business, or as a joint venture, or as a minority shareholder. Apart from in rare cases such as App Store, which is obviously a unique scenario, leaning in is the only solution, such as what Steam are doing. Next slide, please. Next slide. So games. I won't go into too detail on this slide because I'm conscious of time. But essentially, yeah, the big numbers. China is expected to generate $27.5 billion US in games revenue this year. That's 25% of the world total. China's games market is now larger than the US. The majority of that revenue is now mobile. Mobile has grown at an unbelievable rate in China. You'll see on my next slide, which has the sort of growth rates, exactly how that's come about, at what speed. It's pretty amazing. Half of mobile revenue is generated by two companies, Tencent and NetEase. NetEase, only 3 years ago, had zero revenue from mobile games. It now is now one of, well, alongside Tencent, has 50% of China's mobile games revenue. It's pretty astonishing. At any one time, NetEase will have 80 different development teams working on 80 different mobile games that they're planning to release in the Chinese market. Yeah, I won't go through the other points, but because we haven't got much time, apart from the last one, but that yeah, foreign companies are restricted from publishing in China, and not even as minority shareholders. Just to sort of reiterate that point, that if you are looking to publish a game, you'll need to do so through a Chinese business. Next slide, please. So here we can see how things have evolved very fast over the last few years. Back in 2013, we had 17% share for mobile of a 13.8 billion industry. That size of that industry has now doubled in 2017, and mobile has gone from 17 to 53%. It's pretty incredible the sort of speed that's come about. But it means that now the big money is being made in mobile, and a small number of MMORPGs on PC format. Yeah, the landscape is really changing very fast, and mobile is starting to dominate. Next slide. Okay, so just some points on games and what I think UK companies should be keeping in mind. As I mentioned just now, MMORPGs were previously the main focus for foreign companies here, but mobile now has opened up an entirely new front. Mobile is king in China, and is the primary growth driver for the games industry here. The reason for this is we now have around 51% of China's population, which is over 700 million people, who have smartphones, who are using iOS and Android phones. A comment on the preference that Chinese users have for games that are free to play and pay to win. The vast, and pretty much all mobile games that are being developed here in China are being developed on this model. Users here don't like to pay to download apps, to download games, because they want to get a feel for that game before they know they want to commit any money to it. So esports is huge in China. Nobody really knows how big exactly. There's a lack of sort of reliable data on the sort of viewing figures for live esports, but we know it's going to be big. We know it's huge. And after this slide, I've got a picture of the recent League of Legends grand final in Beijing, which gives a sort of sense of how big. Steam is active and seemingly performing well, but Tencent's WeGame, which is essentially Tencent's play on developing a Steam-like platform, is now moving into the same space. So how long Steam will continue to perform well, is we're unsure about. But WeGame, and it's a company we know well, or a subsidiary of Tencent we know well. And if anyone who's joining this webinar has games that they would like to introduce to WeGame, then please do get in touch and we can help out with that. The traditional console market, so Xbox, PlayStation, is negligible in China. The reason for this, consoles were banned in China until April 2015. When the ban was lifted, it was already too late. Users had already moved to mobile, were already familiar with PC, and consoles had missed their chance to build a base here. Other formats, there are other formats where we're seeing companies get deals, win contracts here. So, for example, Fuse, which is an Android console being developed by a company in Shenzhen, have bought the licenses for a number of games from the UK. Arcade rides, so companies here who are doing immersive rides, who are looking to build game IPs into those rides, and also VR as well. Although Tencent NetEase dominate, as I said earlier on, 50% of mobile revenue is accountable to Tencent NetEase. If you're looking at China, you need to look beyond to other key players as well, such as 37, 9, Youzu, Kunlun, Longtu, these guys, who again we know well and are also very large companies in their own right. And so yeah, it's not just a two-player game. There's very much other major players in the industry here. And lastly, a point I'd like to make is that there are increasing number of opportunities to service Chinese companies in third markets. So we're aware of UK companies who are picking up clients, Chinese games companies who are releasing games into third markets, into not just markets in Europe and North America, even markets in Asia, who are looking for the sort of expertise that UK PR companies, marketing companies can provide for their games in those markets. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so just as I mentioned just now, just some pictures I want to show you of the League of Legends Grand Final. 40,000 fans in the Brazil Stadium, pretty incredible. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so VODs, video on demand platforms. So just quick, I'll try and be quick because we're already sort of half an hour into the session. But the big players, so iQIYI, Tencent Video, Youku Tudou, they're all big companies, but they're all struggling to make profits. It doesn't necessarily matter to these companies at this stage because they're all backed by very large companies. So iQIYI is backed by Baidu, Tencent Video is backed by Tencent, Youku Tudou, the merged platform that is Youku Tudou, is backed by Alibaba. So they can continue to make a loss in the short, medium term, but certainly, you know, their goal is obviously to be turning over profits. The key challenge is that advertising revenue is flat for these guys, and they're increasingly moving towards subscription. Similar sort of trend that has already been seen in the West with you know, the likes of Netflix and Hulu, these platforms are now going through a similar evolution. Spending is high, and these platforms they're spending serious amounts of money on content. Partly because they're being forced to do this because the competition is very high, and everybody wants to get their hands on the small number of shows that generally will generate the huge numbers of views. And most of those sort of shows are sort of Chinese TV drama shows, and also sometimes Korean or American, and also from the UK, so Downton Abbey and Sherlock and so forth, which generate, you know, very large followings here. I put piracy is down. I mean, these platforms have become so widespread that their sort of growth and dominance of the video streaming space has helped to sort of drive users away from pirate platforms and onto the legitimate ones, partly because, you know, the cost of streaming is so low here at the moment. And then subscribers, we've seen a jump from 9.45 million subscribers on VOD platforms in 2014 to 75 million in 2016. I'll just jump through the next few points, but you can see on the right-hand side, I've listed 6 of the main platforms. These are between them, you have essentially the lion's share of 7 platforms of the video on demand market here. Each platform has its own different, you know, as a user demographic, and we'll cover other different types of content other than just film and TV, but also children's entertainment, or in the case of PPTV and Lure TV, also live sports broadcasting and so forth. Onto the next slide. Okay, so the VODs are moving into content creation. Again, very much like what's happening in the US with Netflix and Amazon. There are opportunities there for UK companies to potentially co-produce with these platforms. I've put a point that you know, most of these VODs will attend the big festivals around the world. They'll be at Cannes. They'll be, you know, you know, in Berlin or Toronto. There's lots of opportunities to engage their teams if you're looking to sell content to these platforms, and they're looking for all sorts of content, factual, children's, drama, film, you know, you name it. They're looking for a bit of everything, and especially when, you know, like recently, the Blue Planet 2 had record viewing figures on I think it was on Tencent Video. And so, it's not just the drama and the film that gets huge followings here, it's also, the factual stuff. The factual space is very active, as in there's a lot of co-production going on between UK and China, which is exciting. The importation of TV formats, unfortunately, is now a restricted space. Broadcasters can only import one per year from overseas. But there's a new way that companies can work together, which is through consulting on the development of local formats. Children's animation is buoyant. The lack of strong domestic IPs means that there's a nice, well, the import IPs do very, very well here. So that's definitely a good space to be in right now. And then lastly, live sports broadcasting is a growing space. PPTV seems to be emerging as the front runner there. They're yet to sort of monetize on anything like the scale we see in the UK, but I imagine this is going to be a curve that we see in the next 5 years as subscriptions come in and more profitable models start to take hold here. Moving on to next slide. Okay, so just very quickly on applications, I've got one slide for applications. The landscape here, you have iOS, so App Store, which is around 30% of market share. 70%, the other 70% is of Android, is a sort of series of local app stores, logos of whom are on the right-hand side. You can see that the big ones are My App, who have a market share around 25%, which is Tencent. But then also there are other key players such as 360, Xiaomi, Baidu, and then also the handset makers, Huawei, Oppo, and Vivo. So if you're releasing an app in China, you need to be an Android app. These are the channels you're going to be distributing through. And as I say earlier on, companies from overseas are not allowed to distribute directly onto these platforms, so we'll need to work through local partners. That was an extremely quick summary on applications. There's obviously a huge amount you can go into on this sector, but if anyone who's listening has an app that they're looking to release in China, do get in touch and we can speak more about that directly. Next slide. Okay, and then just very quickly, just a graphic to show the market share between Android and iOS in China. Next slide. Okay, and then we're on to the roundup. So I'll just summarize quickly. So regulation is strict on foreign content and companies. Understanding this regulation is important. But local partners will usually be more familiar with the rules and can help to guide and publish on your behalf, though avoid being entirely reliant on them. So you need to build up your own knowledge of how the regulations work here and not be entirely reliant on local partners, because if you're entirely reliant on a local partner, then I personally feel that you lose some of the advantage, some of the edge of working here. Mobile is king, as I mentioned earlier on, with smartphone penetration at over 50%. People here, it's not just games and applications, it's also video content that they're digesting on their smartphones. Like Tencent Video is one of the most downloaded apps in China. UK companies are already very active here. They're selling content, games, applications, film, TV content to the major players here that I've been mentioning today. And so, these platforms, they're familiar with working with international companies. And so if you have a product that they like, then working with them can be quite straightforward. So although it's possible to sell in China from the outside through App Store, through Steam, you really are only going to be scratching the surface. It's definitely worth your while to come out here to develop a strategy for China and try and get a foothold here of some sort. Get that first client over the line and then build from there. Don't just look at building relationships with Chinese companies in China. You know, they're like I said, they're active at all the major fairs and events around the world that you probably will be going to yourself. You know, seek them out, begin conversations, start building those relationships. You know, download WeChat onto your phone, use it as your contact management, you know, software for China, and keep in touch with people. Keep reminding them that you're there, because these companies, they move at breakneck speed, and they're being approached by companies at all times, competitor companies from all around the world and here in China. And so you need to remind them that you know, you're there, and not that they shouldn't be getting distracted by other people if they're interested in what you have to offer. And lastly, you know, listen to the advice that Mathew's about to give. It's some very good tips. So I'll move on to the last slide and then hand over to Mathew to do his part. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. I've been asked to provide an overview of the legal environment here and to talk a little bit about the protection of intellectual property and to provide some tips for negotiating with Chinese companies, and also to talk a little bit about do's and don'ts of contract preparation. I'm an Australian qualified lawyer, and I've lived and worked in Beijing now for 8 years, and most of my work is focused on creative sectors, particularly the entertainment business, film and television, and also gaming, where it's been my pleasure to collaborate with Tom on certain projects. Now, look, as far as the legal environment here is concerned, I think that it suffices to say that you need to dispel a couple of the myths that surround China when you're approaching it. One of these myths is that there are no intellectual property laws in China, and another is that the courts don't work. These things are not true. The intellectual property system that China has developed and its court system are improving very rapidly, and I think that the Chinese probably deserve more credit than they get here. Like anywhere, there are areas where there is room for improvement, but the point I wish to make is simply that many people dealing with China have heard about these problems, and they become what I call self-fulfilling prophecies, in that the foreigners dealing with Chinese bring these things to fruition and make them come true. So what you've got to remember, I think, is that China does have a robust and improving intellectual property system and a legal system, and the idea is to avail yourselves of it, not to abandon it. And a lot of the problems that we see arise because people abandon it. Tom's mentioned censorship, and it's a big factor in almost everything that happens here. And as he said, there's very little detail around censorship. You can study the regulations that apply to certain things and certain forms of content, but in the end, you need to understand that it really is ultimately a political risk, and it's subject to diplomatic vicissitudes. Tom has also talked about how foreign investment or foreign activities are restricted or prohibited in certain sectors, and that is a very important thing to understand or to appreciate when you're dealing with some of the regulations and some of the restrictions in the sector that applies to you, whatever that might be. Now, looking at intellectual property, which is of interest to almost everyone who's dealing with China, there are a couple of things that set China apart, a couple of things to bear in mind. One, in relation to trademarks, is that this is effectively what's called a first-to-file jurisdiction, which means that a party that files a trademark here can ultimately own it, even if they are not truly the the trademark owner. There are some exceptions, but generally speaking, it's a good way to view things. The second thing is that when it comes to copyright, generally speaking, damages awards are very low here. So it's very difficult to prove damages in copyright infringement cases. And if you are unable to meet the high standards of proof, then the general rule is that your damages will be limited to 500,000 renminbi, which is approximately 80,000 US dollars. So that's a very low amount, and what that means is that there is very little traction for copyright law to provide a kind of a disincentive to infringing activities. Now, when it comes to protecting intellectual property, there are a number of things that you can and should do, and in many ways these things are much the same as they are elsewhere in the world, but you should be looking very carefully at using a non-disclosure agreement. And some of the projects that I've worked on recently have included drafting a thing called the UK-China Film and TV Industry Toolkit, which included a pro forma NDA, and I've just done a similar thing for research and innovation sectors in the UK, and these things are available on the UK government website for free for UK users. Of course, also you need to look at any opportunities that you may have to register your copyright or register your trademarks. And you need to be aware in the technology licensing area that China has a set of regulations called TIA, which stands for Technology Import-Export Regulations. And the main sting in their tail is a provision to the effect that when a foreign party grants a license to a Chinese party, the improvements or the enhancements or developments under that license generally belong to the Chinese side, which is, of course, contrary to international practice in that area. So they are some areas to be aware of, and Tom has mentioned gaming many times, and one of the requirements in China, if you're going to import games lawfully, is that the copyright in those games needs to have been registered in China before the application is accepted by SAPRAFT, the State Administration of Print, Publication, Radio, Film and Television. So there's an example of how, perhaps a surprising example of how copyright registration is necessary. Now, look, I'll turn now to some negotiating tips, and I'll round things off with some comments on how to handle contracts. The most important lesson, I think, for foreigners to learn is that when they're dealing with China and when they are visiting China, they must use their own interpreters. It's an easy thing to say, it's a difficult thing to do in practice. What tends to happen is that the hapless foreigner relies upon the friendly interpreter provided by the Chinese side, with the result that the foreigner never knows what's going on and is sitting in and is privy to a whole lot of discussions about the foreigner without realizing it. One way to shut that down, one way to ensure that you are across discussions and you know what's going on, is to have your own independent interpreter. I can't emphasize that enough. Most of the problems that I see come across my desk have their origins in this kind of, in a failure to understand this kind of need. The second thing is that you must be aware of generalities. Chinese negotiators have a preference for generalities. They like to stake out agreements in very general terms. And what happens then is that when the foreigner who believed that they would have an opportunity to drill down into various areas of detail comes back and makes an attempt to introduce detail, it leaves the foreigner prone to the objection by the Chinese that the foreigner is acting in a way that's contrary to the spirit of the agreement, or is perhaps the foreigner is perhaps behaving in a way which is not gracious. And this is a trap that we see a lot, because there is a tendency for the Chinese to push general vague agreements, and the foreigner who comes and has limited time perhaps for negotiations feels that this kind of contract can't do much harm. but in reality it can do more harm than good, and certainly more harm than having no contract at all. I think also as a corollary to that, it's very important not to send your senior executives or your senior management to China for the first round of negotiations. It's very important, I think, to send a technical team or a middle management team to scope the environment and to make an assessment of what's possible before bringing in the big guns. And again, one of the syndromes we see is that the people at the C-suite level will come to China and do deals, and they'll be wined and dined and entertained graciously by their Chinese hosts. They'll return to their home country and they'll believe, quite honestly, that there's no problem at all and that the deal's been done. And then the hapless technicians or lawyers or in-house people at middle management level come in and encounter all sorts of problems. And finally, as a negotiating tip, it's very important to understand what it is that the Chinese want out of the deal. And again, this may not be what it seems. And very often Chinese parties are motivated by desires and goals which are completely surprising to the foreigners and are not what the foreigners would expect or infer would be of interest to the other side in negotiations of the kind that are going on. So very often foreigners will get into difficulty because they didn't really understand what it was that the Chinese were trying to achieve. Now, turning to contract preparation and some of the do's and don'ts there, the most important thing to do before you enter into a contract is to undertake proper due diligence on your Chinese party. And nowadays, it is possible to obtain very quickly and quite economically detailed information about Chinese companies through doing searches of public records. And we urge people to do this so that they can verify that the company exists, that the company is licensed to operate in the sector in which it claims to have expertise, that the people the foreign party is dealing with are the people who actually have controlling interests in the company, whether the company has subsidiaries or affiliates in other sectors and so on. So you've got to do some due diligence to know who you are really dealing with, because if you sign a contract without doing that, then you can find that you've made a big mistake. The second thing, and this ties in somewhat with the point I made earlier about avoiding generalities, you must at all costs avoid short form documents. You must avoid letters of intent, expressions of interest, heads of agreement, anything that provides for a second round of formal discussions. Our preference nowadays is to do documents in one go, which are longer than the typical sort of short form or heads of agreement, but much shorter than a standard long form agreement. And in fact, one of the benefits of working in this environment is that you have an opportunity to do without a lot of the kind of legalese that burdens a lot of documents in the West. So you can do shorter documents without being reckless about it, but not documents that are so brief as to be almost meaningless. And as I said, there's a cultural tendency for the Chinese to want those sorts of documents because it gives them room to move. Of course, you must concentrate on getting paid and you must concentrate on protecting your intellectual property. A lot of the documents that we put together provide, in essence, the time frames don't start running against the foreign party, or deliverables from the foreign party aren't required until such time as substantial amounts of money have been paid or sufficient money has been paid upfront to make the deal commercially viable at that point. Now, finally, what I want to talk about is choice of law and jurisdiction, because this is a very important point, and it's often a point that is misunderstood by foreigners and legal luminaries in other countries. And this is the thing, that generally speaking, Chinese courts do not enforce judgments of foreign courts. And what that means is that if your agreement is subject to the law of England and Wales, or if it's subject to California law, as many agreements are, if you want to enforce your agreement and you obtain a judgment in either of those two jurisdictions, the Chinese courts will not accept that judgment or will not enforce it. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, this is what happens. So what it means is that you need to make a clear-headed assessment of appropriate law and jurisdiction from the beginning. And if you are dealing with a privately held Chinese corporation with no assets abroad, then the only appropriate law and jurisdiction will be Chinese law and jurisdiction. And that alone will give you the leverage that you need in the event of a dispute. And we find that when contracts are approached this way and when appropriate choices of law and jurisdiction are made at the outset, the Chinese party tends to respect the foreign party much more. And the very problems that I opened with in terms of finding that Chinese courts don't work, whatever that may mean, or that there's no intellectual property laws here, those problems don't even materialise, or if they do, the scale at which they materialise is much lower. And finally, we have a preference for bilingual agreements. While there is no legal requirement in China that agreements be written in Chinese, what you need to remember is that the end game of a dispute, which is the part of the game you want to avoid, is played out in circumstances where Chinese language will apply and Chinese language decision makers will make decisions. And what those decision makers will generally do, whether they be arbitrators or judges, will be to appoint an interpreter when a contract has not been drafted in Chinese. And the problem is that the court appointed or decision maker appointed translators generally produce poor quality work. And the problem that you have with your contract or the interpretation for which you contend is not supported by or made clear in the translation that you get. And ultimately, as part of the negotiation process, when you use a bilingual document, you are in no doubt at the end of the day, if the document's done properly, that the Chinese party readily understands what you require, and that also tends to reduce the likelihood of disputes. Now, I can see that we've run out of time now, so I'm pretty close to the time allotted, but I wanted to, and I hope I have given you some sense of the legal environment here, some sense of how intellectual property ought be protected or how it can be protected, some cultural tips for negotiating, and also some tactics for contract preparation. So I'll leave it there. We're both here in Beijing, happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Tom. And those were two really fascinating presentations, and very in-depth as well. We don't have all that much time, so I'm only going to ask a couple of questions. And the first one is from Harry, and this will be for you, Mathew. And it's around your point about interpreters, and Harry's asking, how do you go about finding the right sort of interpreter to help manage this process you've been describing?
Well, look, if you call Tom, or ask me, or ask our friends at the UK Embassy, and both of us liaise very closely with them, they will put you in touch with people. And I know Tom's got something to say on this too.
Yeah, so Harry, we have an interpreter translation service at the China-Britain Business Council. So when it comes to interpreters accompanying companies to meetings, then we have partner companies who will provide interpreters who have experience in the specific language that you need to be using in that meeting. So if it's technical language, say for example, if it was related to film production, then there are interpreters that we know who can be brought in for that sort of meeting. So get in touch if you need an interpreter in China, and we'll help to arrange that for you.
Thank you. And a question we've just had in from Ruth, and it's how do you carry out searches of public records? I think it refers to a point you're making, Matt.
Well, look, it depends what you mean by public records, but if you want to conduct searches of company records, which are generally available, then either Tom or my firm can conduct searches, and what you're looking for is somebody who can do the searches in Chinese and ascertain the fundamental information about shareholders, scope of business, controlling interests, and these other things. And look, the Chinese are quite good with the information. You can often obtain financial information, litigation histories, all sorts of things. For deeper searches, sometimes you need a different type of person, but generally speaking, this is fairly straightforward. And Tom, CBBC does it, and we also do it.
Yeah, it's what we call a sort of AIC check. AIC is the government body who oversees a bit like Companies House in the UK. And a lot of these records are online, but as Mathew rightly points out, you need to be able to read and write Chinese in order to search them. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll do one more question, and this is from Louise, and it's about a point you sort of allude to, Tom, but kind of in terms of brand Britain, how strong is the demand for British products out in China?
It's a good question. So it varies sector by sector. I'd say the UK brand is overall very strong. I think people see the UK as being a place of high quality products, of prestige, of heritage. I think when it comes to the games industry, for example, the Chinese industry here is very familiar with the history of British games. We have a lot of companies that have been around since the early 90s and since the 80s even. Which the concept of that in China is kind of mind-blowing, because they didn't even have a game industry back then, and so I think we can use it to our advantage, the UK brand, but sometimes it can also be a disadvantage, but we aren't seen as being the most sort of technologically advanced or innovative country, which obviously is false, because we do have a lot of companies who extremely well in these areas, but that can be some of the other side, where maybe there's a sort of perception that a little bit more negative towards the UK, but that's something that we need to work on.
Great. Well, we're slightly overrunning here, so I'm gonna call it at that. But thank you so much to Tom and Mathew. Some really fantastic insights into, obviously a very fascinating market, and really fantastic advice. So thank you both.
Very welcome. Thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for listening.
I'm just going to whistle through our kind of outro slides very quickly. We're coming to the end of the year in terms of events with the Institute, but as ever, please do have a look at the training and qualifications the Institute runs. There's a massive range of support on offer there, so please do go to export.org.uk to look into all that. And in terms of our next webinar, the second part of our Creative and Tech series is next Thursday, the 23rd of November, back at the normal time of 2 p.m. We're running that again with China Britain Business Council and also our resident e-commerce experts, Thrive Digital. Please have a look at the page we've made for the sectors, which is on the slide there. And also do have a look at our opentextbook.com/webinars for more information on the rest of the webinar program this year, and some updates on what's going to be happening next year. But as always, please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions for improvements or future topics. That's all from us for now, and have a great rest of the week. Goodbye.